Copyright notice. You are free to download and copy this work in audio format for replay in any audio or video mode, and I encourage you to do so and enjoy and learn. You may redistribute it in a non-commercial fashion, that is, not for profit directly or indirectly. You may not sell or seek to profit from this publication in part or in whole, nor may you translate it into any written format for any purpose. Thank you. Chapter 22 of the E-Novel survival novel, When the Walls Came Tumbling Down, as read by the author. Manifest Destiny. At the hangar, there was an air of panic that Tim and a dozen of his men were trying to contain by keeping the people busy. A busy person has less time to panic, something he had learned in stressful situations, especially with pampered clients who had no idea how to handle real stress. The radio crackled with reports from the towers indicating they were being heavily engaged. John Casolo had envisioned numerous scenarios that they might encounter and had solicited Tim's input on the matter, but had essentially rejected anything that didn't essentially bolster the ideas John had. Tim had wanted them to prepare for the eventuality of being attacked by a larger military force, but John had said that was impossible. Now, however, this threat that was attacking them was not the mob that they had been planning on. In an enemy, you needed to respect one that had several attributes. One attribute to respect was his skill with their weapons. Another, that they were organized and well led. Another, that they were determined. And the most pertinent attribute in the enemy was the fact that they had the attribute of being there. Tim needed to get the chunks of people out of here. The two aircraft outside would carry a maximum of 92 people between them, essentially civilian versions of the CH-47 Chinook helicopter. Tim knew that they could squeeze on more people if they were children or small, but when you added in the luggage these people wanted to take, it was impossible. Tim had taken John Casolo aside and said that if they left the luggage behind, they could put over 100 on the two birds. John had flown into a rage and said they would stick with the plan. Tim wondered if the bastards on the first lift would send the birds back for the subsequent ones. Tim also knew they couldn't hold out indefinitely. This enemy had already taken out 4 towers and seemed capable of taking the rest down within the hour. Tim saw a lot of bickering as several people on the ladder lift sensed the situation was going bad. Like roaches smelling poison, a mouse that senses a cat is nearby. Tim watched for a moment in amusement as one man was offering to buy another man's position on the first manifest. He was refused, and Tim had to turn his attention elsewhere. John Casolo was insisting that the observation helicopter be prepped and that he would fly in it. Tim was wanting to put that bird into the air to help take out the enemy machine guns and noted that the pilot was standing outside the bird, not inside the seat where he belonged. He trotted over and the pilot said that Casolo had ordered him out of the bird because he feared he would fly away without him. The co-pilot was inside helping Casolo drag an oversized suitcase out to the bird. Tim had an idea what was in it. He looked at his men, thought of the men in the Quick Reaction Force, some he had served with over the past decades. Brave men, honorable. Then he juxtaposed that against these selfish and wicked people who, even in the face of danger and his men being slaughtered, seemed only concerned with themselves and taking their wealth along, even if it meant leaving their friends to a certain death. Tim's Irish temper got the better of him and he made a command decision. Alamo units, fall back to the hangar. I say again, fall back to the hangar. John Casolo stood up when he heard this and stormed over into Tim's grill. What the hell are you doing, Commander? He spat the last word out like a curse. Tim smiled at him. It was over. He was terminating his contract while there was a chance to save himself and his men. He pushed past the angry little man and called the rest of his men over to a huddle. They moved to a corner of the hangar, including the pilots. John could not believe the impertinence of these people. Who did they think they were? He started to walk over to their little clandestine meeting, to break it up, but the way that the commander looked at him told him not to. He had not had anyone address him so disrespectfully, nor to dare make eye contact with him, and in a hostile way, too. He felt sick with anger and rage, and knew there was nothing he could do right now. He would wait. He would have his revenge, though. Rescue. Running through the woods, faster now, dog at her side, she saw up ahead, only 300 meters away, a man with his back to her. He was pointing his shotgun at something. It was Al. Quickly, she dropped down to the prone position, just like he had taught her. She lined up on the man with her body, took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and let out the air. At the middle, she stopped the breath and opened her eye. She was off a bit, so she moved her feet. She could hear his voice. It's not the first one to shoot, it's the first one to hit that wins. She quickly adjusted her feet, tried again. She was on target now. She squeezed the trigger and saw the man topple and fall. He fell into the grass, and she could not see him. She rolled to her left before she got up. Never jump up from where you just shot, or you will get shot too. Somebody may be watching and lined up on that spot, and when you get up, they got you. The dog at her side, she ran over to the spot where the man had fallen, and Al ran up at the same time. The man was laying on the ground, shotgun beside him. He had been shot in the shoulder, although she had aimed at the center of his back. She had pulled the trigger a bit, she figured, but still got a hit. Al had his weapon on the man, and she knew he would not shoot. "I got him, sweetie," she said, and I was still a bit in shock. The man had nearly gotten the drop on me this time. He was a clever one. "I didn't even see him, honey. Thank you." She paused, then said, "You're welcome, Rice." Greg chimed in. "Well, ain't that sweet? Rice and beans. Want some hot sauce beans? I got some right here." "Quiet," I said, and the look on my face told him that might be a really good idea. I was tempted to kick him for being so rude, but knew he was done. This time he would be going back. That shoulder might preclude a trial and a hanging, though. Maggie was pressing against my leg, as she was trained to do when she sensed I was upset. I needed to get my flex cuffs out of my pack, and I told Jacqueline, "Keep him covered, Beans. If he moves, shoot him in the face." She looked at me and said, "I got him." I quickly shed the pack and was reaching inside when I heard her shoot multiple times. Maggie flinched and I jumped in shock. I wasn't ready for that much noise that close. She shot him several times in the groin, and he screamed in pain. "You shot me, you whore," he said, holding his hand between his legs and rolling onto his side, bellowing like an animal. I stood there in shocked disbelief, and she looked at me blankly and shook her head, then swiveled back and fired one more time into his head. She saved her weapon, closed the dust cover, then glanced back over her shoulder. "I think you won't need those now, dear." I couldn't believe what I had just seen. "Why did you do that? He was surrendered. You can't do that." Angrily, she put her rifle in her left hand and stepped up into my face and poked her finger at my nose. "Are you for real? What? You gringos watch too much television." Then continued, "Honey, this man is bad news. The sooner he was gone, the better." Motioning to the house with her head, she said, "What, you think we're going to find up there, huh? You think we'll find he's been helping her move the furniture and chop wood?" Then the part that hurt. "If you would have stepped up back when you had him the first time, none of this would be necessary." I thought about what she meant, about what I was sure we would find in the house, more victims, and realized that I had been too idealistic and not practical. While I didn't want to be some Wild West vigilante, I knew it was not realistic to expect we were living in Switzerland at the moment either. Things would have to change, and some exceptions would have to be made. "Oh, and you're welcome too," she said, referring to the fact she had just saved my life, which was true. I stood there mesmerized, looking down at the corpse of the man, his face frozen in a grotesque contortion, with half of his head split open on the back by the hollow .5.56 round. Touching my arm to break the trance, she said, "We need to go look at the house, dear," then added, "I don't think we're going to find something good in there, though." She had a way with words, this woman did, even if they weren't what I wanted to hear. The flow. The fallen flowed through the target area smoothly. An occasional shot was fired, but overall it was quiet. Too quiet, Mike thought, and he spoke over the net. "Stay frosty, people. Something's going on." Where was that QRF, that quick reaction force? Danny showed up in his body armor and helmet with his rifle presently. It was not allowed for the president of the club to go into fights, but Danny was a from-the-front leader, and Mike had to set the club rule aside. "I heard on the radio. I bet you they're near the birds. It's where I would be." Mike didn't relish the idea of fighting the nearly 30 or so that might be left, but knew one thing was true. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. He needed to know where that QRF was. They were a huge variable right now, and if deployed effectively, could cause serious casualties to the fallen, if not actually defeating them. He would rather engage them when he could pick some of the terms than to be blindsided. Red Team reported nothing in their sector except servants, and only a couple of these had been shot trying to resist. Blue Team was in the servant village and had encountered some minor resistance, and Green Team had the furthest to go in reporting that the helicopters were lifting off, moving hot and fast too. Mike calculated that if the birds were overloaded and in this thin morning air they would have less lift, they would not be able to fly that fast, that way. They must be empty. The damn pilots must be flying the coop and leaving their clients. One of the gun trucks opened up and followed by the rest and hit the trailing bird. It seemed to wobble a bit in the air and then nosed down and rolled into the right, crashing into the tree line and bursting into flames. Danny got on the net. "Green Team, this is Hawk 6, let the birds go. Concentrate on the main objective." Mike looked at Danny curiously, and Danny explained. "Mike, did you see the door gunner on that observation bird?" Although the civilian version of the military Loach, or Light Observation Command helicopter, had flown very near, Mike confessed he hadn't, had been watching the transport birds to see if they had passengers. Danny was turned now to watch the helicopters fading into the night, and stated, as if to no one, "I did." Then turning, he said, "Mike," he took his right hand off the gun and waved it in front of his face. He was letting me know he was not engaging us. I think that this rest of this mission is going to be a mop-up. Walks like a duck. Bill didn't like what he saw in the military patrol as it went through the town. They had said on the radio their purpose was to scout ahead of their unit for safe passage, but he didn't buy it for a number of reasons. He had shadowed them innocently and from a distance, pretending to be walking home and even smiling and waving. To their young eyes, he was just some old man. They didn't realize he was a combat veteran who recognized a recon when he saw one. They weren't looking at a route, though. They were looking for a route in. They turned up several side streets, even though they appeared to have a working GPS. The military satellites would continue to transmit indefinitely, he knew, and they had daggers or Defense Advanced GPS receivers and were using them frequently. They looked like an official military patrol, but Bill knew they weren't. As soon as they left, he took charge because Al was gone, which was a stupid move. He had put the entire town at risk, and worse, now his woman was out looking for him too, and neither of them could be found. That was another matter. The one that irritated him most was being left in command, and it looked certain a big attack was coming. He knew what he needed to do, though. He called an emergency meeting of the leadership and explained the situation. He told them that the recon was focusing on them, and then showed on the map where the places were. Next, he pointed to where they had entered and left the town and said, "If I were them, I would be holding up right about here," and he pointed to some farmland just a few miles away. "That's where they can stage and even rehearse before they hit us." He went on to say, "They have gun trucks. We don't know how many." That sank in slowly, and then he continued, "They will need these in the fight. They have overwhelming firepower." A few frightened looks, and then he concluded, "And we need to keep them, these gun trucks, out of the fight." He then laid out the avenues of approach that the enemy would most likely use and explained that the terrain and density of the forest precluded them coming through the woods with the vehicles. While people on foot were able to infiltrate the area, vehicles were not and had to use the roads. A roadblock with a sign on it wasn't going to work, though. The town had a bulldozer and a road grader, and these would be parked and chained together to block the main road with stacks of timber lashed down on either ends and running back into the woods to prevent anyone from bypassing them. The dozer and grader would be moved into position when the attack was imminent, which Bill said was soon. OP-LP, or observation post listening posts, would be set up to watch the roads coming in, well away from the roads and far enough out to give them plenty of warning of the advance. A separate patrol would have to be manned on the south and east sides to cover the forests in between in the event they tried to infiltrate on foot first, bypass the roadblocks, and then defeat them in detail. The roadblocks would have to be treated like a military obstacle, would have to be protected by observation and fields of fire. Bill next gave out assignment and posted a new guard schedule. There were groans in the room, but then he stopped and said, "Folks, this is serious. These people weren't here for fun. They aimed to hit this town." There was a sigh because Bill didn't normally talk like this unless there was a reason. He was old and seasoned and had the respect of all. "People, this isn't a probe like the last ones. These folks have serious firepower." There was a commotion of chatter, and then someone said, "When is Al coming back? This is his job." Many angry approvals. "Why did you let him go?" came another comment, and more approval. Bill held up his hand. "Al did what he had to do. It wasn't the smartest thing, but it was the right thing in his mind, and he is as stubborn a mule as any man I've ever met." A few laughs, and someone said, "I think he's worse than that even," and then the laughter died down a bit as Bill concluded. "I have the assignments, people. This is not a drill. This is not training. This is for real." The leaders filed by and drew their copies of the guard schedules and mounts, then went out to contact their people, to conduct the rehearsals and prepare for what they knew would be a nasty and ugly fight. Bill knew that the people were not tracking, though. They were not understanding what the real danger was. They had successfully repelled smaller groups over the past weeks and had a false sense of security. Only he and a handful of others that had been in combat with an enemy who put up a real fight knew. As he looked around at the ones who had been there and done that, they exchanged knowing looks and then set about the work of preparing. Destination. "Where to?" the pilot asked over the net, and Tim said north. He had no real plan right now. He was in shock. He had just lost over a dozen of his friends. It made him angry, but what could he do? "Head for the airport up in Presque. We'll figure out what to do when we get there." He needed to think. He needed to plan. Up until now, it had all been about the mission at the compound. Now that was gone, and in a way, he had his pay and more. He knew by the weight of the trunk at his feet there was over $500,000 in gold there, and probably a lot more in the other chopper stashed in the other people's suitcases. Perhaps other things of value as well. They had their weapons, but only the basic load they normally carried, plus their nods, night observation devices, and a few other pieces of gear and the guns on the helos. Not a terrible start, but far from a good or ideal one either. He had a friend that lived up this way, he remembered, a man that he knew from decades ago, and recalled he lived in some town near Caribou, but couldn't recall the name at this particular moment. He had, of course, not been able to leave the compound, and so had not been able to make contact with his friend, but was pretty sure he could find him. The man's name he remembered well, though. His nickname, Arctic Al. Therefore made perfect sense that he would move up this far north. Tim could attest to the cold and Arctic conditions here for sure. Slip away. John Casola couldn't believe what had just happened. The security force had rushed up, throwing the members off the helicopter, striking several of them quite violently when they didn't comply. Their luggage had been left on the birds, though, strapped down in the center of the aircraft and under the seats. The men had loaded into the birds and taken off in a matter of minutes. They had also taken John's suitcase. He didn't worry about that much, though. There was plenty more at home, but he had to survive first. Soon men began to appear out of the dusky morning, firing their weapons. John had scurried and hidden in a storage locker inside the hangar, but noted that many of the members had fled on foot. There was a gate that led out to the woods to the south, and many were speeding that way in their carts. Some were running on foot, and several of them were shot down. John saw all of this before he went into the storage locker and closed the door behind him. He could hear the men outside now, talking in muffled voices. One of them, laughing, joined by the others, at some sort of joke. A shot rang out inside the hangar, and then there was silence. He overheard a conversation near the locker. "Why did you shoot her?" one man demanded. The other said, "The Prez said to shoot all the rich bastards." More laughter, and the first one, who had said, "Yeah, but she was pretty." The man simply said, "Sorry, bro. Don't worry. Those servant girls are probably hot-looking enough, though. Better than your old lady, anyway." The men had all laughed, and then it grew silent. That was it, his way out. They were sparing the servants. These were fairly smart men. They would want someone to wait on them, to cook for them. Pretty servant girls for sex. Who were these men? Perhaps they could be bought. He thought about that for a moment and realized it might be wiser to do something else. Satisfied after a while of silence that all was safe, he slowly and almost imperceptibly opened the door to the locker, and when he was sure it was clear, he tiptoed out and heard a lot of commotion outside, some shouting, and occasionally a shot fired in the distance. His mind had formed an idea, though. He found a pair of workers' coveralls and slipped into them. They were a bit baggy in the shoulders, but it might work. He would pose as a technician, as one who had knowledge of something important. These men would need someone who knew how things worked, and he did know the inner workings of this entire place. He could pull the ruse off, and when the time was right, he would call on the secure line, call his senator, and see if they could dispatch some troops here to get his place back. Pioneers. Despite the cool weather, the black flies were coming out now, causing a lot of discomfort for many. Still, there was nothing that could be done, and so the people had worked all morning erecting huge barriers on either side of the road. The road grader and the dozer would block the road itself. Kevin had taken his place both at work and on his OPLP duties, as well as patrol. Almost everyone had, and they were exhausted. When Linda volunteered to be on patrols, though, his heart fell through his chest. No, she couldn't. What if she got hurt? She had mentioned it to him in passing that she was on patrols, and he had started to protest but had stopped himself. He had no right and no claim to this woman, no place in her affairs. Still, the pained look on his face was obvious. Linda saw that look and knew. She knew this man had developed deep feelings for her, and she could not deny that she was both flattered and also more than a little interested. He was handsome, to be sure, but more so, he was strong and decent. She was not looking for a replacement for her Mark. No man would ever have that place in her heart. Rather, she knew that the page would turn. It always did, and there would be a future. Or would there be? She knew full well that this attack meant and could mean. It could mean the end of their town, which is why she wanted to volunteer for the guard, for the patrols. She also knew she had feelings for Kevin. She had walked through the woods one night and stood looking at the stars and talked to Mark. She could sense him smiling down at her from heaven, encouraging her to be happy and to move on. She felt a little disloyal for the thoughts she already had, but now felt as though it all made sense. Life would go on. She would never forget Mark, but she also had to live, to survive. Kevin was taken aback, therefore, when Linda came up to him and said, "Would you walk me home?" Would he? Of course he would, but he remembered Liz's admonition to play it cool. "Sure, Linda, let me grab my rifle and we'll go." They slung their rifles over their backs and walked. He noted that she did not walk at a distance or like she was in a hurry. It was different, like she was walking just to be with him. It made him smile inside, and he saw her as so beautiful despite being sweaty and having smudges of dirt on her face. She captivated him. As they walked, she said, "Kevin, you know I've lost my husband just a few months ago." His heart lumped up in his throat, and he tried to speak, but she cut him off. "I know you're interested in me," he interrupted. "I'm sorry, I should give you more time. She held up her hand to stop him. "Please, let me finish." He stopped, and she continued. "In normal times, people would consider me hasty, but I'm being practical, Kevin." Pausing for a moment to resolve herself, "I don't care what others think right now. I only care what is right." She looked down at the ground, and he wasn't sure where she was going with this, what she was going to tell him, if she was going to tell him to leave her alone. He would, of course. He already felt so badly for being so obvious. The feeling of elation he felt when she asked him to walk her home dissipated, and he realized she was walking him to get rid of him, to tell him to go away. She could see the emotions swirling in his eyes as she spoke to him and realized what he was thinking. He was feeling rejection. She smiled a bit and then took his hand in hers and spoke softly. "You're a good man, Kevin. Know that I'm interested in you, flattered at your attention, and also interested in you." She looked at the ground and then up into his eyes, and with a little mist in them, "Please, just be patient with me a little longer. I need to be sure. I've been through so much." He didn't know what to say, how to react to this. Part of him wanted to sweep her into his arms and kiss her, and tell her that it would be all right. The other part couldn't believe she had taken his hand. It felt so soft and almost electric. Was this really happening? Of course, Linda, all the time you need. Why did he say that? Why couldn't he just smile and say yes? Why did he always have to add things? Yes should be yes, and no should be no. He would probably never learn. Still, she smiled at him and then turned to walk up the hill toward the house. He stood there stupefied, and she stopped and said, "Well," motioning with her head toward the house. He smiled broadly at her and rushed over to walk beside her to her home. Going up the steep part of the hill to her front door, she took his arm for help, and he noticed that she didn't let go of it until they got all the way to the house. Her hand did not pull away abruptly, but gently slid down his arm, and then she adeptly took his hand in hers and squeezed it lightly before dashing away and saying, "Thank you, see you on patrols," as she slipped inside the house. Kevin walked back home about a foot off the ground. He did not sleep a wink that night, his mind and heart consumed with Linda and thoughts of her. In too deep. As the vehicles pulled up into a wagon wheel with the Humvee setting on the outer perimeter, Ox was aware of how tired he was. Not just physically tired, but mentally exhausted as well. This entire idea of the Army had seemed a good idea at first. Now it was becoming a nightmare. These people ate so much, the buses needed so much fuel, so many details. Mitchell also knew that Ox was no first sergeant. The rest of the troops didn't know any better, but Mitchell knew it, and Ox knew that he was a fraud and he was exposed. It had happened early on. Ox said something and Mitchell had called him on it. Ox wanted to get belligerent, but he knew he needed this ranger and the ranger needed him. Mitchell liked taking charge, but not being in charge. The burdens of leadership and responsibility were tedious to him and frightening. He just wanted to lead, to train, to be out doing things. The Ox, well, all he wanted to do was take the easy way out. Nothing wrong with that, but impossible when you have so many people to care for. Mixing the women in had become a real problem, too. One of them, a woman named Maria, had seemed to show an interest in the Ox, and she had approached him while he was walking through the rail yard. He knew what that meant, that she wanted him, so he had laid his cards on the table. She had pretended to be shocked, but he knew what that meant. Women all wanted the same thing. They were just too messed up in the head to know it. He had forced himself on her, and when she fought him and tried to scream, he had knocked her around a little. He held his hand over her mouth and took her. When he was finished, she had run away crying, and Ox figured she would keep it to herself like most women did when that happened. But she hadn't, and that had been yesterday. Now there was trouble brewing, and she was telling her new friends, apparently. Shamran had told him of the scuttlebutt, so now he had this to worry about too. He would have to keep that woman in front of him. She had a rifle after all and would not hesitate to use it. He had seen her getting on the bus, and the look she gave him told him that she was going to kill him if she got a chance. Ox kind of liked that, though. Finally, a woman with some spirit in her. Maybe they could work something out. He'd get Mitchell and a couple of others to bring her to him later so they could discuss it, perhaps. Who knows? Right now, though, he had bigger problems. While the fuel was holding up a bit, the diversion down these damned back roads had consumed a lot more than they wanted. They would need the fuel for the Humvees when they got to their destination. They could burn vegetable oil eventually, Shamran said, but they would need to keep changing some things on the vehicles, the filters, and also the way the fuel was fed. Vegetable oil would freeze up and had to be warmed to be liquid enough to combust and to flow through the fuel lines. The Humvees were the platforms for the crew serve weapons, and that is what gave his force their manpower, their main firepower and capability. The people were eating way too much, and Ox told Shamran to put them all on half rations, but Mitchell said that was a very bad idea and advised they conduct another raid instead. Ox didn't want to mess with a raid, and Mitchell said he would handle it, which Ox was more than happy to acquiesce. When they got to St. Quentin, Ox would find himself a farm, perhaps with a woman that knew how to farm and take care of him. He wondered if Maria knew how to farm. She had spirit, that was for sure. In either event, he would hand the operation over to Mitchell. Like selling him a business, he would get certain considerations, perhaps a percentage or part of what they took in exchange for it. Either way, Ox was done with this headache. It was nothing but trouble. Mitchell had a target picked out now, the little town of Stockholm with a population of 254. Mitchell had done a good recon and figured they had less than 100 people that could bear arms, and while they had some organization, he knew they didn't have weapons like Ox and his crew did. Although he could field 100 people, only a dozen of them were worth a damn, but those heavy weapons made all the difference. He had the firepower with those guns to equal double their number. Mitchell explained the metrics, the numbers they would need to have a successful attack. 5-to-1 odds give you an almost certain chance of victory. If each army has 100 people with equal skills and equipment, the defender would have a 2-to-1 advantage because they didn't have to maneuver or expose themselves in an attack. If the defender had defensive positions, that could increase their numbers to 3-to-1 or more. Mitchell said the amount of territory the people had to defend was too large, and he saw no defensive works other than the roadblocks. The town was not set up like a castle or a military outpost. It was just a farm town. The heavy weapons, combined with picking a good point of attack, would ensure them closer to 1-to-1 odds, especially if they could engage the town's forces in an open field battle requiring them to fire and maneuver. This might mean a pirate victory, though. Significant losses, and Ox thought about that one long and hard. He could care less about any of these people, that was true, but he would also need some of them when they got to their destination at St. Quentin. Still, if they took some heavy casualties, and it was limited to the speed bumps, his not too affectionate name for the civilian add-ons, that might be good. Kind of like working a man all week long and then hoping he got killed on payday before you had to pay him. Mitchell had said they would use the civilians for probing attacks and to occupy and contain the enemy forces while he maneuvered the gun trucks. The M2 or 50 caliber machine gun was a fearful weapon on the battlefield, and he knew the defenders didn't have one. They could set up the weapon beyond small arms fire and engage if needed. The projectiles were the size of a man's thumb, too. Huge. The 240 Bravo, or 7.62 machine gun on the turret mount, was equally devastating in a different way. That being said, he didn't want to burn up all their ammo just to get some food. The town would be hardest to hit from the south and easiest from the north. Unfortunately, that route was harder to traverse, whereas coming in from the south allowed them to deploy their gun trucks more readily. The armor plating would stand against anything the civilians had, and only a roadblock would stop them from driving right into the center of town and taking down the fire department, which seemed to be the command post. They would hit the town from the south. The roadblock was nothing but an old man with a stool and a sawhorse. They would sweep through the town and take it within a matter of hours or less. This has been Chapter 22 of the e-novel survival novel, The Walls Came Tumbling Down, as read by the author. Tune in next Friday for Chapter 23.